Okay, folks. So I have finally had a chance to sort of gather my thoughts and sort of get my feelings oriented as to how I feel about the Kouri Richins trial, the recent Kouri Richins trial. Okay. And also to sort of gather my feelings and my impressions as a person who does work in federal criminal law. Okay. I do work as a consultant and as a legal writer and as a legal researcher, okay, in the area of federal criminal law. So, with that background, just to kind of gather my thoughts about and my impressions about Kouri Richins' defense team. Okay, we're talking at this point. Sky Lazaro, she had to withdraw from the case, right? She had a conflict, so we're left with Kathy Nestor, Wendy Lewis, and Ramos. I forget his first name now. Okay, but I have looked a little bit into them, and I've sort of thought about their performance. I mean, obviously, we're talking about some very intelligent people, right? So, these are above average lawyers. Okay, so we're not going to discuss whether they're smart or they're not smart, but just my overall impressions as someone who works in the business, is kind of inside baseball, whatever. Just my personal impressions of the defense team and kind of this idea. You're always going to have this problem when you work in criminal law. You're always going to have a problem. How much does the defense team buy into the defendant's con? Okay, to some extent, it's always a problem. Um, it's not really a problem in the cases that I work on because I work with some really hardcore criminals. Okay, hardcore criminals. They're generally not really conning themselves as to how bad they are or how criminal they are. They kind of know how criminal they are. So they're not self-deluded. And so when you're representing, like, say, for example, like, say, internet transnational cartel members, okay, or if you're representing like say a Venezuelan drug boat crew, okay, we represented countless crew members of these boats that come from Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And when you're representing people that are just, like, say, just as a way of life, I mean, they're involved in like heavy duty crime. Okay. A lot of times you don't really run into that problem where they're like too self-deluded. We've had a few clients that were maybe a little on that spectrum, but I think with a person like Kouri Richins, she's not really a career criminal, so to speak. She's sort of a suburban person. She's a suburban housewife, basically, who has I think, some psychological issues. Okay. It's not your standard criminal profile. Okay. She has psychological issues. And I think they are sort of, I mean, obviously very narcissistic issues. Okay. So when you have narcissistic issues the way she does, okay, it is very hard for these people to really fully accept the kind of person that they are. Okay. They want to see themselves as a different type of person than what they really are. And it is really hard to get them to, and in fact, it's not really the attorney's job to help them do that. Okay. So when you have a client like that, to some extent, there is a pressure when you're working on a defense team to sort of buy into their delusion, to some extent. And I guess I want to raise this as an issue because, and in this way, I can discuss both the psychological aspects and the defense team. Okay, because I think this defense team, before I get into this analysis, if I had one criticism, if I had one hardcore criticism, okay, I think they bought into Kouri Richins' own personal pathology, her own con. Okay, and they started confusing like a legitimate inquiry, okay, into whether there was more than reasonable doubt or less than reasonable doubt as to whether she committed murder. Okay, so just looking at that without getting into anybody's delusions or anybody's false sense of who they are, or Kouri Richins, to some extent, I think she's conning the whole world, and I think she's conning herself. I think she's avoiding seeing herself for who she is. But leaving all that aside, I mean, just cold-hearted, just looking at the evidence, and just honestly saying, looking at everything, like, say, all the circumstances, all the evidence in their totality. Okay, is there really room to really argue that there isn't, like, say, proof beyond reasonable doubt that she committed murder? Okay, so that's one aspect. But you see, attorneys, they feel, or not all attorneys, but a lot of attorneys feel like they have to be the best friend of the client, and they have to be the perfect person for the client, and the client has to love them, and they have to believe everything the client wants. And there does come a point I mean, to some extent, you have to bluff a little bit according to, like, say, the client's delusions, and that's horrible. But to some extent, you have to kind of pretend like you really believe everything they say. But at some point, I think a good defense attorney can't be 100% on board with all the delusions of their client. Okay, and so I think if I had to really give like a gut feeling, like my gut reaction as a person who works in criminal defense, right? My first impression is that, to some extent, yes, if you work as a defense team representing a self-deluded person, okay, you do have to buy into their crap to some extent, right? But I guess my impression is they were buying too much, I think, into Kouri Richins' actual pathology. Okay. And I think when you do that, I think juries and I think the court, and just the public, I think we can sort of tell that it just crossed the line. For example, if you look at the defense team who represented Bryan Kohberger, okay, for a long time, okay, they were bluffing in their defense. Okay, they were pretending for years that they had a legitimate defense. Okay, they were pretending for years that they had an alibi defense. Okay, and you know because I work in the law, I can sort of feel what people are doing. I can sort of see the cards that they have. I'm sorry, because I've just been around. I could tell from the beginning that was just 100% bluffing defense. Okay, it didn't come from the heart. It didn't come from personal belief. It's just lawyers doing their job. Okay, so Bryan Kohberger, he had this huge bluff. Okay, this huge bluff that he wanted the whole public to think that he had a serious defense. And in the end, the attorney was smart enough to play the right cards. Okay, because in the end, okay, sadly enough, defense attorneys or any litigator, you are a professional poker player. Okay, you are playing a game, and you have to bet your chips, and you have to make your bets, and you have to be careful, and you don't want to accidentally put all your chips. You don't want to accidentally put all your chips on a stupid bet, okay? Because everything will come. Well, you'll get a lot of bad consequences, and a lot of attorneys, what they'll do is they'll put all their chips in because they think they have a great appeal if they lose, okay? And when attorneys are self-deluded about the merits of a possible appeal, okay, that's when you're actually harming the client, okay, because you're getting deluded. And in my opinion, I just think that Kouri Richins' defense team was a little high on Kouri's supply, her own con, her own self delusions. And I think somehow that have infected the defense team, that they somehow think that they have a good appeal at this point. Now, appeals are kind of hard to predict. They might have one or two appellate issues. The problem is, and I'll explain this later, appeals are not as easy to win as people think. Okay, so this kind of like, I don't know, this complacency, this cockiness, like, we'll get them in the appeal. Just you don't want to be so you don't want to be so complacent or so arrogant. Appeals can be very difficult to win. So before I get into the actual analysis here, I just want to say, my first impression, and the reason why I'm going to combine these two topics today, is because I feel the biggest defense error, okay, was maybe getting too close to Kouri, like almost like a friendship. And I think getting to the point where it felt like the defense team crossed the line and they were sort of believing too much and sort of supporting Kouri too much and her own obvious delusions. And I think it was causing the defense to not evaluate the evidence properly. Okay. And that's a sad thing for me to see because, attorneys, we should be like doctors, lawyers, we should be able to really survey and analyze evidence and represent somebody vigorously, give them a vigorous defense, but also be sober and kind of understand what the evidence really looks like. Okay. And not to be self-deluded, because that can really be dangerous. Okay. And so the point of this video is, we know that Wendy Lewis and Catherine Nestor, these are actually very intelligent people. Okay, I'll get into it a little more as I get into the analysis. I'll explain where I'm coming from. And it's really sad for me to see really intelligent people sort of misjudging the overall evidence, and that's a fundamental dangerous. And in the end, that was actually bad for Kouri. Okay, so anyway, so I'm going to go into more detail here. But I just want to explain that the purpose of this video really is to discuss both Kouri's psychology and the quality of the defense team. So let's get into that. So before we analyze Kouri's personality and before we actually analyze how the defense team did at trial, okay, let us first just introduce who is Kathy Nestor, who is Wendy Lewis, okay, and who is Alex Ramos, okay, these three people. Okay, number one, I think a lot of people are under the misconception that they all work in the same firm. Okay, as far as I can tell, and this is just my superficial research, okay, it looks to me like Alex Ramos is actually local counsel in Park City. Okay, and it looks like Kathy and Wendy have their own firms separate from Alex. Alex has his own, I think he has his own practice with another partner in Park City. Okay, so he is in a different, let's say a different law firm, different law office. Okay, so he's separate. And I guess you want to call him co-counsel, you want to call him local counsel, whatever you want to call him. Okay, so that's number one. And there are advantages to having local counsel. But Kathy Nestor and Wendy Lewis, they operate a small law firm in Salt Lake City. Okay, but here's the thing they all have in common. They do have something in common. They are kind of at an upper level, let's say, in the criminal defense world. Okay, why is that? Wendy Lewis, number one, she is the brain. Okay, it turns out she's very, very smart. Okay, she was. Anybody who went to law school, you understand. There's people that are on the law review. They're kind of like the really successful law students, right? I was not even on the law review. I'll just be honest, right? I wasn't that good. I mean, I was pretty good. Actually, I was pretty good in law school, but I wasn't at that level. Okay, so I recognize Wendy Lewis. She was on the law review at the University of Utah. I mean, it's not not the best law school, but it's pretty good. And she has experience. Okay, in the very beginning of her career, she actually worked as a clerk for a 10th Circuit federal appellate judge. Okay, so she actually worked at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. This is the federal appellate court below the Supreme Court of the United States, right? And so the 10th Circuit, if I understand correctly, I mean, I could be missing a state or two. I think it's Oklahoma, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, something like that. There may be Wyoming, whatever. So that region, that kind of Midwestern, that Western region, mountain Western region, right? That is the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in the federal system, right? And so Wendy Lewis, coming fresh out of law school, apparently she worked as a clerk for one of the appellate judges in the federal system. Okay, so that's a very elite opportunity, and that is kind of the pipeline for some of the very best attorneys in our American system. Okay, so that's number one. She got her teeth cut early at a very elite level, in my opinion, working in the federal appellate system. Okay, now I do work in the federal appellate system. Okay, I've written, I can't even remember all the appellate briefs I've written in the federal appellate system, right? So, and I work in the 11th Circuit, right? A very difficult circuit if you're in criminal law, right? So I do have some idea of what it means to be have experience as a federal appellate clerk. Okay, so that's pretty prestigious. And then Wendy apparently went back to clerking at some point after she had practiced for a while in Utah, right? And she then worked as a clerk for a federal trial judge at a federal district court, District of Utah. Okay. So that's also pretty good experience, okay, because that's more trial level experience. So Wendy, in my opinion, has really been seasoned, I think, at a pretty high level. And then Wendy apparently worked for quite a while as a federal public defender. Okay, now a lot of people think of public defenders as kind of these sloppy let's say they have a heavy workload, they do kind of sloppy work. But the federal system's a little bit different, okay? And so the people who work at the federal public defender's office, these are above average attorneys. These are attorneys that are really up to the federal standards. It's kind of, federal court is a little more formal. It's a little more like no BS. It's like no BS. It's very, let's say, it's very serious, okay? And so, like say somebody like Jose Baez, from Florida, if he walks into federal court, he's going to have to button up a little more than when he's in state court, right? So federal court is kind of a different world. It's really just no monkey business. It's no BS. It's a little different. It's not a clown show. Let's put it that way. So it's pretty serious stuff. And as it turns out, Kathy Nestor also has experience as a federal public defender. Okay. And if that weren't enough, just by coincidence, I guess, Alex Ramos also has experience as a federal public defender. So these are people that come from kind of above average. You know, these are very intelligent people. The average people do not get to be federal public defenders. Okay. So these are people that are above average. But I will say from my experience, because I also work, you know, in the world of federal criminal defense. So I bump into federal public defenders all the time. And federal public defenders are often very aware of the cases that I work on because we also work in the appointed system, in the federal appointed counsel system. It's called the CJA system, right? And so we show up in a lot of cases, and the federal public defenders are often watching our cases because a lot of our cases have ended up having very leading appellate issues floating up in the appellate system. And so a lot of cases that I've worked on have gotten a lot of attention from the federal public defender system. And I've sort of had a lot of interaction and sort of dealings with the world of federal public defenders. Okay. And so the first thing I'm going to say, the positive of federal public defenders is they're above average intelligent and they're above average competent. Okay. But the problem with anybody in any public defender system, okay, there does tend to be a little more of like a righteousness or like a sense of mission that a lot of public defenders they're really very, I would say, ideological. They're very ideological. They're very pro defense, but to the point where I think the ideology starts to sometimes eclipse their better judgment because they're not thinking personally independently about the actual case, but they've got all their ideology sort of brought into their judgment. Okay. And they tend to be a little bit emotional in how they assess evidence, and their passion, their sense of mission, that passion for, you know, look, federal defenders don't always believe their clients are innocent, okay? But they believe in the presumption of innocence. You see what I mean? But that's so political and it's so ideological and it's such a sense of mission that sometimes that passion and also because people in that system are often part of a community of people that are in the federal defense bar and the federal defense community. Okay, and these people, they act like almost like it's almost like a tribe, you know. And whenever you're too tribal and you're too like community oriented, your individual assessment of things tends to recede, and you become more of like a groupthink kind of person. Okay. Now, granted, these are very intelligent people, so they're not dumb people. It's just that kind of bias towards this kind of like sense of mission and this ideological idea, you know, the defendant's rights, and it's just so political and it's so passionate that I think sometimes those people are not very good at just playing the cold game of poker. Okay. Now, not always. Some of them are very good, but it just depends on the case, depends on the client, you know. But if for whatever reason you just get a little bit too much sympathy for a client and you get a little too codependent with the client, okay, I think especially in a case like this, I think there can be too much of a desire to want to read into the tea leaves maybe more reasonable doubt than what there really is. You see what I mean? And so, you know, in the end, when you're looking at a whole bunch of evidence, you are looking at a Rorschach, you're looking at a Rorschach image, okay? And so the way you interpret things is going to depend a lot on your biases and what you want to see, as opposed to what's really there, okay? So that's kind of like how I'm going to introduce, let's say, the characters in terms of the defense players, okay? And if anybody wonders, like, well, what happened with Sky Lazaro? You know, like, I don't really know Sky Lazaro's background, okay? But I don't think she has the background that Kathy Nestor and Wendy Lewis have. I think they have more, let's say, high level criminal law experience. I think, from what I can tell, Sky Lazaro is just a very busy criminal defense attorney, okay? But I don't know that she has, like, say, I don't know that she's at the caliber, if you want to call the seasoning or the elite level that both Kathy Nestor and Wendy Lewis are at. But I might wonder whether maybe Sky Lazaro has a better objectivity in terms of the actual merits of this case. Okay. And that might be part of why in the end she had to withdraw. They say it's because of a conflict, but I just think honestly, because the walk the dog letter, because it mentions Sky Lazaro, in all honesty, she was actually going to be a witness as well as an attorney. Okay. You cannot be both an attorney and also a witness, because she would have to be a witness to the actual to the way in which she was tied into the walk the dog letter and how that might actually impact the actual merits of the case. Because the way, if you read the walk the dog letter, if you read it honestly, okay, it does seem to reflect some consciousness of guilt. Okay. And because Sky Lazaro is sort of tied into that walk the dog letter legitimately, you could say she's also a witness. Sky Lazaro becomes a witness as well as an attorney. And I could see how maybe some law firms or law offices, they may have a policy that an attorney who becomes in any way a witness to their case, it may just be a law firm policy that we won't even touch that. Okay. In addition to maybe just basic rules of professional, rules of professional ethics, right? Um, so it's kind of sad that Sky Lazaro had to come out, but I'm always kind of wondering, maybe Sky Lazaro in the end would have been a better attorney for Kouri. But it's also funny, from what I could tell from the walk the dog letter, Kouri Richins called Sky Lazaro, I think she called her a bitch, or she basically expressed that she didn't really love Sky Lazaro. So it's kind of funny. If Sky Lazaro did have a more objective assessment of the evidence, I wonder if it's an accident that maybe she didn't get along that well with Kouri Richins. So anyway, just leave that all on the table. But I did want to sort of start by introducing sort of the backgrounds of these attorneys, and especially the fact that they've worked as federal public defenders. They're in a very community, sort of politically oriented system with a lot of ideology. Okay, and how that might sort of cloud their judgment, especially in a case that's very circumstantial. Okay, so the next piece of this big puzzle here, okay, is Kouri's personality. Okay, Kouri's psychology, her personality. Okay, I really want people to understand, that the vast majority of criminal defendants, at least the people that I'm used to running into, the kind of defendants that I represent or I help represent, right, are not generally as deluded as you might think. I would say the vast majority. I mean, I've represented gang members. I've represented people that were conspirators and massive drug trafficking. I mean, huge amounts of drug trafficking. Cartel members. Drug boat crew members. I represented people that were like trafficking like modems and electronic equipment to Cuba, which is totally against the law. And I can't even remember all the people. I've just represented people that committed carjackings. I mean, just horrible things, including killing people, right? So, I've seen my share of, I say hardcore, call them almost like career criminals, right? And at least in the kind of defendants that I'm used to dealing with, I'm not used to dealing with people that are actually deluded. They're actually not mentally ill at all, And sometimes I even ask myself, are they really psychopathic? I mean, I think to me, a psychopathic person is a person who's kind of like has some delusion going on, or how would you say? I think a lot of people would say, well, maybe they're just conning everybody. But I do think to be a true psychopath, you have to almost kind of believe, you have to be high on your own supply. You have to be kind of high on your own supply. And most of the criminals, I'd say the career criminals that I've dealt with, they're not really high on their own supply. They're pretty realistic, and they actually they take their medicine really well. It's amazing. I mean, they have behavior issues. Okay, so, but when you deal with somebody who's truly narcissistic, like say Sarah Boone's another example. Okay, it is going to be difficult to represent that person, okay, because their psychology is going to interfere with the job of the attorney to give the best advice and to proceed in a way that best protects the rights, okay, and best protects the interests of that defendant, right? So when you fall into their delusion, you're actually becoming a codependent collaborator in their delusion, which is ultimately self-defeating. So in my opinion, I actually think it's a Sixth Amendment constitutional problem when you're representing someone who has a fundamentally deluded personality. Okay. Because if you try to be realistic with them, they're probably not going to like you. And they will end up defeating their right to effective assistance of counsel. Right. So I don't think I don't think the United States has developed its constitutional law, as applied to, the Sixth Amendment. We haven't really developed a very sophisticated analysis of how to deal with representing people that have, delusional personalities. Okay, and I think that's an area of the law that probably the United States we're never gonna. It's not our style. Maybe like the Netherlands or Denmark or maybe some European country might get into that, but the United States, it's not our style to be that gourmet. We're not gourmets when we come to the I don't know, these little fine issues, but it is actually a serious issue in my opinion. So we have to talk about Kouri. Okay, now I have been diagnosed with a personality disorder. At this point in my life, I don't even know if I believe I really have a personality disorder, but I do believe I come from a family of people with, let's say, we are the type of people that would be diagnosed as personality disorder. There's a lot of addiction in my family. We have a lot of anger management, attitude. We're kind of rude. We're rude people. We're kind of on the rough side. My parents are actually very well educated, but you know, I don't know. It doesn't matter how well educated you are. I mean, you know it when you feel it. When you're in a family that has a lot of, like, say, borderline and narcissistic and just turbulent emotional crap and addictions as well. So that's my background. So in a way, I try to be very realistic about how I see people that are labeled as narcissistic, because every single narcissist is very unique. Okay, there is not a cookie cutter narcissist. Okay, we want to think that every narcissist is exactly the same robotic professional narcissist. Even we say narcissists like they're professional narcissistic people. Like, they have like a talent for doing. It's not talent. It's a personality type. Okay. Unfortunately, people with narcissism have a lot of dominance. They're very dominant. They're kind of fearless, and they are manipulative, and they're also exploitative. Okay. They exploit people. Okay. So those, you could look at those as like talents, or you could look at it as just it's an aggressive competitive personality type, right? A lot of people in this world are aggressive and competitive. Not all of them classify into that special category of narcissism, but narcissism is basically a subset of people who are aggressive and competitive. Okay, there's no question that Kouri Richins had elements. Kouri Richins had elements of what could have been a successful business person, right? She had a fearlessness of getting into debt, right? A lot of people would be terrified to assume the kind of debt, and she was like juggling the debt, like massive debt on properties, and she was juggling it like it was like second nature. I mean, now she didn't do it very well, but I mean, just the fact that she wasn't terrified of how deep in the hole she was getting with her business, that shows you that she had a very special characteristic of tremendous fearlessness and aggressiveness, like, say, I guess. But without getting into the label of what kind of personality she has, I could almost wonder if maybe Kouri Richins could be mentored to be like a professional, like, poker player. You know what I mean? Although I think a good poker mentor might get rid of Kouri in the end because she's too impulsive. To be a really good gambler, like a professional gambler, you have to have very disciplined risk management. Okay, and you can't really be like a total. You can't be you can't be a train wreck. You have to have like a lot of, like, not as, you have to be more than just fearless. You also have to be like effectively intelligent in real time. Okay. Now I do believe that Kouri Richins is intelligent, but I think in real time, in the actual heat of the battle, as she's juggling all this debt, all this business debt, I think she falls into self-delusion, and people that are self-deluded cannot win in gambling, or, like, say, poker, let's say. So Kouri has like elements that almost would make her ideal to be like a professional poker player, or, like, say, maybe a hardcore business person, but she would need severe mentoring. Doing it by herself, that was too much. She didn't have the integrity, and she didn't have the self honesty, okay, to properly evaluate her risk, and to properly evaluate just how she put herself in a place where she didn't have a realistic opportunity to actually be successful. Okay. So unfortunately, Kouri Richins, the fearlessness is almost impressive, because, like, if she could like say in another world, and maybe if she had like the right mentors or whatever, that kind of fearlessness could be perfect for taking risks like in an intelligent way. But the problem is that Kouri Richins just didn't have the effective intelligence to actually apply her talent, if you want to call it, of being a fearless, aggressive person, right? But it is important to note, she is a fearless, a severely high level fearlessness person who is also very aggressive when it comes to taking massive risk. Okay. The other thing too is that it seems to me that Kouri and Eric, her husband, okay, it seems to me that there was just an atmosphere of competition. I think we really minimize and we don't focus enough on the fact that Eric Richins, I think, as a husband and as an individual, I think he was a very competitive guy. Okay, Eric Richins was super competitive. Okay, and so for somebody like Kouri, who herself is kind of competitive and she's kind of aggressive. Okay, and she likes also to play the game of life, like really high stakes. I think she was probably triggered by Eric, and I think Eric probably triggered like a lot of her hunger for the game, for the game of taking risks and trying to shoot for super success, but taking massive risks, right? So I think that Kouri, if she already was like say susceptible to kind of getting into trouble, the kind of person who could get herself into trouble, I think that Eric sort of like put gasoline on the fire and made it worse. I think Kouri felt tremendous drive to maybe show Eric and show Eric's family that she could be at their level, that she could realize like fabulous success on her own. And people would just have to look at her and say, hey, you did it. Like I think Kouri felt a tremendous amount of pressure to be seen and accepted by people at a high level as being like worthy of their level, right? So in that sense, I mean, I don't just want to call her a psychopath. I mean, I know I do believe that Kouri Richins is probably pretty close to a psychopath. Okay, let's just be honest. But avoiding the labels, because regardless of the label, every person is unique. Okay, so what I want to focus on here is just this combination of this intense drive to be successful, but also this ability to take huge risks and not be afraid. Okay, that's dangerous. Okay, so she's in a competitive marriage, and at some point she got herself underground, or she got herself like in the red, like a lot of debt in her business. Okay, her business is upside down. She's trying to like just float payments, trying to service this debt on all these properties, and she is just not able to be solvent in her business. So under this pressure, okay, I mean, other people would be terrified to like say embezzle money from their own spouse. Okay, but no, she just didn't have the fear. She didn't have that block that would make her either shy or terrified of actually stealing money from her husband, because the drive to be successful and the drive to save her business was so strong. Okay, it just overrode any possibility that she would maybe take some time or maybe even talk to Eric and ask him for the money. She probably knew that Eric wouldn't give her the money, so she just took it. So I mean, let's not be so precious. I mean, I know there are people out there, oh my God, how could she steal the money? Look, I am not a righteous person. We're human beings. Okay, I'm sorry. Human beings we are liars. We are cheaters. We're selfish as a human race. We treat the wilderness of this world. We expand our population. Even if we're the most wonderful human beings, we as humans to get, as a community, we just expand our civilization. We couldn't give a crap really about animals and wilderness. There's exceptions, but generally we as humans, we are not good people. Okay, I don't think we are fundamentally great people. I think humans can have a good side to them. Okay, humans can have good qualities, but all in all, humans also have a lot of bad qualities. So I'm not shocked that some people steal and some people cheat. I mean, we can't be too utopian. Humans have that, or at least a lot of humans have that possibility. So I'm not shocked, but I do note and I do pay attention to the fact that it was very easy for Kouri to cross the line and actually do things that were just completely wrong. Okay, and also very risky for her. Okay, let's leave aside the morality. When you start embezzling money like in six figures, okay, from a husband that has a lot of, let's say, a lot of wealth, you are exposing yourself to some serious issues. Okay, and it's interesting when Kouri, we have these recordings, where Kouri actually admits that she took money from her husband, but the way she justifies it, you can tell that she was conning herself, I think. I mean, you could say, well, maybe she was just conning her friend. Maybe privately she knew that maybe she wasn't so successful. But I kind of wonder. I wonder if maybe Kouri sort of filtered information, like on the one hand, oh, I got all this debt. But on the other hand, I got this mansion worth $11 million or whatever she said it was worth. I don't even know if it was worth $11 million, but she kind of selected the more shiny and beautiful parts of her situation and sort of didn't think about the worst parts. Now, you could say, well, maybe she's just conning her friend and she knows all too well. But I think, just because I can kind of relate to her in my own way, I think a lot of people like this, I think they really they don't like bad tasting things. They like the shiny, beautiful things, right? So the bad tasting things, you spit that out or you just avoid it, and you just tend to focus on the more positive things. Okay. And so I think Kouri, in a weird way, I think she just kind of knew she had a lot of debt, but I think she had this faith, like this faith that a lot of deluded people have, that if she just juggled and kept juggling, she would eventually sell the mansion for a high price and everything like a chain reaction, all the debt would get paid and she would be somehow, she rationalized that she might actually be on the path to being like a really successful person. I'm not, it's hard for me to understand exactly what she thought, but I do believe to some extent, I think she got high in her own supply and she had to sort of see herself and her situation in the most positive light possible to the point of delusion. Okay. So I do think that to some extent, I think Kouri Richins, I mean, I know at some point she knew when she was asking for opioid, like when she was asking for opioid pills. I think deep in her heart, she knew it was to kill her husband. She's not that deluded, okay? But I think generally she tried to operate sort of with the most favorable way of seeing herself and the most favorable way of seeing her situation, okay? To the point that I do think it was bumping on the borderline of delusional, okay? Because that's the comfort zone for her and she doesn't tolerate, let's say, uncomfortable, unfavorable ways of seeing her situation. So that's kind of a classic, I don't know, I'd say, it's kind of in the neighborhood of psychopathy. I think a lot of psychopaths are kind of like that, where they have trouble being honest with themselves, like really, really cold, honest. Okay. And I think some of us kind of know what that feels like. So that's kind of like my first bite at trying to figure out Kouri Richins, just very fearless, very competitive, very unafraid of risk, very like the kind of risk that would give panic attack to some people. For her, it was just juggling and she was able to, I don't know, just not be terrified, by things that would terrify other people. So that kind of fearlessness, that kind of very dominant, very, very ambitious, and also able to cross lines. Okay. And at the same time, maintaining kind of a deluded sense of herself. And for the purposes of understanding Kouri Richins' susceptibility, okay, to being able to possibly commit murder, okay, maybe we can reformulate this in a more elegant way, in a more efficient way, and just say that bottom line, for the purpose of her risk to possibly commit a murder, okay, she had the combination of a lot of drive. Okay, Kouri Richins has a lot of drive, but she doesn't have a lot of inhibitions. Okay, she's uninhibited. She's a very uninhibited person. Okay, and I guess it kind of makes sense if you're over consumed with drive. The more drive you have in life, the more your inhibitions are going to kind of reduce. Okay, so what I'm thinking is that because the marriage with Eric was sort of heating up with tension, okay, because she had stolen money from Eric. Eric was already starting to kind of want to get her out of his life, at some point. And because he's a Mormon, he couldn't just cut her off too quickly because he's, Mormon families, they're very tied into maintaining the whole family together. And it's very hard for them to reach a place where they just want to kick somebody out. So I think unfortunately, I think Eric's religious background kind of slowed him down from just kicking Kouri out. But I think Kouri could feel that Eric had kind of caught her doing some bad things, and that Eric's attitude as a husband was sort of changing. And I also think that Kouri felt possibly that Eric didn't really believe in her and maybe didn't really respect her, and maybe he wasn't really going to be a fully cooperating the way that Kouri wanted to have cooperation with her personal house flipping business, right? So I think that, if she already was a person with a lot of drive, and if she already did have kind of a diminished level of inhibition, let's say a person who's not very inhibited, but who has a lot of drive, I think that distance between drive and inhibition, I think it became more dangerously separated. And I think she started developing more drive, and her inhibition started going down even more under, let's say, the recent pressures of the marriage, where she was really feeling trapped in the marriage with Eric. She knew that Eric wasn't her ally anymore, and she was just, let's just say, she was desperate to get out of that situation. So if she already did have a lot of drive, and if she already did have diminished inhibitions, like just a person who was not very inhibited, right? I think it became worse under the pressure of the marriage. Okay, so I would not say that, let's say take Kouri out of that bad marriage. Okay, let's say Kouri, in another world, let's say she married a guy who wasn't as competitive as Eric. Let's say she married somebody who was a little more cooperative with her business and maybe didn't have the Mormon hangups. In another world, maybe Kouri would have had sort of the basic susceptibility to like a possible psychopathic situation where she has just like too much drive and almost no inhibitions, right? But let's just say if she was in a different situation, let's say a more favorable marriage, she might not have it so extreme, because I think the stress of the marriage and the pressures of the marriage and the I would say the unfavorableness of the marriage was kind of like putting her under so much pressure that I think her psychopathic symptoms got worse. Maybe she was subclinical psychopathic, but she became clinically psychopathic under the pressure of the marriage. Okay, so I would say Kouri all her life probably had a risk that she would tend to be not very inhibited and also maybe having too much drive. But the point I'm trying to make is that maybe in a different setting, in a different environment, she wouldn't necessarily be under such pressure that her natural symptoms would become exaggerated, maybe to the point of being clinically important. So I think what we can say, at least I think it's obvious to me, that the adverse circumstances of this very bad marriage, I think, sort of put Kouri under the kind of pressure that made what was possibly a subclinical psychopathic personality become suddenly on the verge of being a clinical psychopathic personality. Okay, and so what does that mean? When you have someone who has intense drive, lots of drive, and they don't have a lot of inhibitions, okay, you can get to a point where it starts to become an impairment. It's kind of like the equivalent of being on drugs. Okay, when you take certain kinds of speed, like say methamphetamine or cocaine, it does the same thing. It makes your drive go up and it makes your inhibitions go down. Okay, and so I think that, let's say the natural neurological cocktail that Kouri already had, her natural tendency to be heavy on drive and sort of not very inhibited as a person, I think it got worse under pressure. Okay, and so when you're in a situation like that, you cannot honestly say that she had 100% sobriety. Okay, it wasn't because of drugs in her case, or maybe she took a few drugs, but let's just say she did not have the advantage of like a full level sobriety in the pressure of that marriage. Okay, so I can at least say, she didn't really have, like, say, she didn't really have the neurological foundation. And unfortunately, she didn't choose which brain she was born with. Okay, a lot of us don't have a brain like Kouri. Okay, but the kind of brain that Kouri does have and that she was born with, unfortunately, under the specific pressures of her marriage and combined with her own natural ambitions and all these things, I think it intensified her neurological, let's say, her neurological characteristics. It sort of intensified those characteristics, so that effectively, as she rounded that year, where at the end of the year, she started like looking for these opioid pills. I think in fairness, I don't think she had the full sobriety that she would normally have, let's say, in a different situation. I think she was getting into a point, she was getting into a crisis point in terms of her own stress in the marriage and her own desperateness to somehow resolve this marriage, this problematic marriage, that I think effectively her brain was impaired, and I don't think it's fair to say she was 100% sober. When your inhibitions decrease enough and when your drive increases enough, you're effectively just as unsober as a person who's taking a small amount of methamphetamine or some modest amount of cocaine. You effectively are in that lack of sobriety. Or anybody who has had an addiction, let's say to playing slot machines in a casino. There is an addiction where people become truly addicted to playing the slot machines in a casino. And anybody who's actually experienced that, you can honestly say that when you get into that dopamine cycle, okay, you are not sober. Okay, your brain chemistry has changed to the point where your drives and your inhibitions are separate enough that you are not really sober and you need help. You can't, a lot of people can't independently by themselves cure themselves of a, let's say, a gambling addiction. Gambling addiction is one of the most serious addictions that exists in the world. And anybody who's had that addiction knows that you are not sober in that condition. Okay. And so likewise, I think because Kouri, I think, has a natural gambler's brain, even though this wasn't specifically a gambling situation, it was kind of a gambling situation combined with the pressures of the marriage. And I just think that her, level of dopamine and the intense level of her drives and the low level of her inhibitions, I think effectively rendered her, in my opinion, not fully sober. Okay. And I do think it's unfortunate that in this country, we have not developed a realistic sense of how to apply psychology in criminal cases. Okay. There are times when this is not a career criminal. This is a suburban woman who has a susceptibility because of her brain chemistry, because of her neurological foundation, her own, let's say, her own, I don't know, how would you say it? Her own constitution as an organism. Okay, under the right combination of stress and business stress and business ambition and all these things, under the right combination, she was effectively just as unsober as someone who's addicted to the slot machines in the casino. So if we lived in a perfect world, we would at least put some credit on the table, and at least allow for discussion as to the actual effective level of sobriety of Kouri Richins, given her, let's say, essential psychopathic characteristics. I think in a perfect world, true psychopathy, honestly, true psychopathy, where you're actually impaired, where you don't have the behavioral regulation because your brain does not allow you to be sober enough to have the right kind of behavioral regulation. In an ideal utopian world, that would actually come in as a mitigator, not an aggravator, where you may end up spending the rest of your life in jail, but at least there will be some understanding that you weren't really fully sober. You know what I mean? And so I just want to, before we get into analyzing, her, the merits of her actual case, the murder case, before we get into analyzing the merits of the murder case, I do want to put on the table that I do not think that Kouri is a fundamentally sober person, and that became worse under the pressure and the adversity of her marriage to Eric. But the final, and let's call it narcissistic cherry. Okay, let's call it the narcissistic cherry on top of what is essentially basically kind of a psychopathic personality. I don't think Kouri Richins is fundamentally narcissistic. I think she's psychopathic with a narcissistic cherry on top. But that cherry on top of her basically psychopathic personality, okay, is this total inability to process unfavorable and unpleasant information. She just does not process information that is fundamentally unpleasant or unfavorable in terms of her situation and who she is as a person. Okay, so that's very narcissistic. They say that the hallmark of narcissism, when you really boil it down, is just this super discomfort with anything that would possibly threaten your sense of self-esteem or your sense of who you are as a person. Like, it really destroys you to have to process things that are not very nice about yourself or your situation. Okay, so that's kind of a fundamentally narcissistic that's kind of like the bottom line of narcissism, if you want to say that. And I think we see that with Kouri Richins. She just has a total inability, apparently, to process any information that reflects badly on her as a person, or that is and in any way unfavorable about her situation in life. Okay, so anything about her situation and who she is as a person, she just cannot process information that isn't favorable to her. And that's an impairment. That's actually, I think that also impairs someone's sobriety, because if you just can't even process that information, you do not have a brain that can competently function in the world, and you do not have normal sobriety like ordinary people have. You have an impairment. I mean, people think of narcissists like, oh, they're just abusers. Okay, they do cause harm, yes, but you have to understand that they have an impairment. There is an impairment because they're not processing information in a full balanced manner. That is what it means not to be sober. Okay, so the narcissistic cherry on top of Kouri's fundamentally psychopathic personality, because let's say if you want to boil down psychopathy to its basic, psychopathy really is just high drive with low inhibition. I mean, if you really want to be mathematical about it, the fundamental core of psychopathy is just high drive, low inhibition. I mean, and then if you want to put like a narcissistic cherry on top, some people have a combination where they have basically they have like a psychopathic constitution, but at the same time, they have that narcissistic complication where they just cannot process adverse or unfavorable information that has to do with who they are. So, Kouri really pulled some bad cards. I mean, she got dealt some bad cards. She does not have the best neurology out there. She's operating in a way at a disadvantage when it comes to the, like, say, the sobriety aspect of life, and also being honest about who she is. Okay, so with all those things on the table, all right, I don't think we can avoid, in trying to figure out who Kouri Richins is, we cannot avoid how unbelievably supportive and unbelievably, I would say, indulging her family is. Okay, from what it appears, both her brothers and her mother, it's almost like a family system where it's sort of been decided somehow in the family that Kouri is like this princess. She's this absolute princess, and the family just cannot see her. And this is important. The family cannot see her in an adverse or an unpleasant or in an unfavorable light. Okay, so in a way, you might say that maybe Kouri learned how to have that selective, that kind of selective processing of information where she cannot bear to process any unfavorable information about herself, because maybe she was raised in an environment where there was just no tolerance for unfavorable information, let's say about Kouri. Maybe Kouri was somehow designated in the family as a very precious, let's say a very valuable, beautiful girl, or who knows. I don't know what the family situation is, but it is amazing how loyal that family is, and that loyalty, almost to a fault. And it sort of reminds me, I was so perplexed when, let's say, the Chad Daybell, every single one of Chad Daybell's children thinks he's the best guy in the world. It's not just that they don't think their father could have killed their mother or killed some woman's kids. It's not just that, but they really think their father is this great, great guy, And so in a way, we could almost say that families can also be narcissistic. The whole family system can participate together in a complete inability to process information that's not favorable, let's say, to some member of that family. And that is a very narcissistic, I would say it's a very narcissistic way to process information and to reject and not tolerate information that might balance out someone's perspective about, like, say, someone in the family. So when a family sort of designates somebody as like this untouchable person who's just perfect and just wonderful, you just can't see them in a bad light. Just like Chad Daybell's kids, they cannot see their father in a way where he is not a great guy. Okay, that is a selective processing of information, and that selective processing of information fundamentally is a complete intolerance of adverse information. Okay, so you're not processing information in a sober, balanced manner. That is a distortion of information. It can happen at a family level, or it can end up happening at an individual level, And granted, I mean, who likes to process unfavorable information? None of us we don't enjoy processing unfavorable information about ourselves. Nobody enjoys it, but some people at least develop the ability, even though you don't enjoy it. Just like when you first taste, like, say, coffee, like, I don't know, maybe some people are born liking coffee, but imagine the types of food where you have to acquire the taste for the food. Let's say maybe anchovies or some kind of olives or something. You're not born to like that food. You have to kind of acquire the taste. And so if you're not taught, let's say, or let's say some people don't like eating fish with bones, like they hate it. But maybe that's because they weren't taught to eat fish with bones. Maybe they weren't raised. You have to get over that first hurdle where it's kind of an acquired taste, and then you learn to like it. So it's kind of the same thing. Some people just haven't been raised to learn to like, say, the bitter flavors of having to process unfavorable information about one's own self. So I don't know if all of that is genetic, or maybe it's partially genetic, partly upbringing, but I can see how the family sort of has exactly the same processing limitation in seeing Kouri in any way that's not favorable or not positive. Okay, so whether it's all genetic or whether it's learned or a combination of both, you can see that whatever narcissism Kouri has on top of her basic psychopathic, constitution, neurological constitution, it also seems that the whole family has sort of agreed that adverse information about Kouri just will not be processed and will not be tolerated, regardless of the evidence to the contrary. Now, what's interesting is that I do think that some people who acquire this narcissistic characteristic, okay, they can have a way of infecting other people with that narcissistic characteristic, in the sense that when they're around other people, it becomes so obvious that they are just absolutely intolerant of anything negative about them, right? And they don't even have to say it. It just becomes like in the air. You sort of feel that is a no-go zone. That as you get to know a person like that, just subliminally nobody says anything, but you just feel that person, you can't even approach anything unfavorable when you're talking about that person, right? And so the people around that person will sort of be infected by her absolute resistance to anything unfavorable being processed about her. Okay. And to give you guys another example that I think is like such a good example. Now, it's so funny because I did a video about Meghan Markle. I did a video about Meghan Markle a couple of years ago. And at that point, I just couldn't quite see how she was actually a narcissistic person. I mean, I thought, okay, she may have narcissistic characteristics, but I didn't know if she could, I didn't feel like there was any way that I could say that Meghan Markle actually had the disorder, like a diagnosable disorder. Okay. And I still don't know if Meghan Markle has a diagnosable disorder, but I do know now, after having really thought about it, I do know that Meghan Markle, just having watched her, she also gives off the aura. She doesn't say it in words, okay, but it's just the atmosphere around Meghan Markle. You can tell that she just will not process any information that is unfavorable about herself. She just will not process any information. It's an absolute rejection of any possibility of processing any information unfavorable about herself. Okay. And so, whether she has all the other elements to give her like an actual diagnosable disorder, at least we can see that's a narcissistic dynamic. It's a narcissistic characteristic. And I think we can see the same thing with Kouri. And so because she sort of gives off the aura of not tolerating anything unfavorable about herself, my fear is that she might infect people close to her, including her attorneys. Okay, so if you have attorneys that are already programmed ideologically to be like so sympathetic to criminals and criminal defendants, and just to give them whatever they want, and just to kind of spoil the defendant, you almost wonder if you run into a situation where attorneys that already have that predisposition, they will be infected by Kouri's inability to even approach anything unfavorable about her. Therefore, the attorneys may start to feel that it's just unapproachable to talk about anything unfavorable about her case, about her criminal case. Okay. And I think at that point, if you're not a strong defense attorney, okay, and you just get high on the supply of your criminal. The criminal starts to infect you with their delusions and their biases. Okay. And if you actually buy that and you can't approach any kind of interaction with that defendant where you can give them just a little bit of honest feedback about their case, in my opinion, that can be very dangerous in the sense that the defendant is not going to get the best representation. Okay, they're not going to get the best representation. And what I mean by that is, like, say in a case like this, if I were defending, well, let's say I don't defend clients. I work with attorneys that defend clients. But if I were on the team, okay, defending Kouri, okay, within just a couple of hours, I would voice my opinion. And I would say, look, we need to get to a plea agreement. Okay, she is guilty. All right. That's what I would say. I say we need to do a plea agreement to best represent her interests and her rights. We got to get her into a plea agreement. Okay, so we got to work the steps. And there's different ways to work the steps. You can either do it like Brian Koberger, where you put on this bluff defense, and then you get the state to be open to, like, say a lesser plea bargain, or you start from the first minute. Okay, from the first minute you just go with the let's say the theme of let's say contrition, in the sense that, from the very first minute, we're going to present Kouri as someone who has finally come to be honest with herself. Okay, and she has not only accepted responsibility, but she is profoundly remorseful. She's embarrassed, and it's very hard for her because she's not used to being able to see herself in that way. It's a struggle for her, but that she is committed to accepting her responsibility, and she is deeply remorseful. And that if you just maintain that theme, the idea is that let's knock off the aggravated murder. Let's just go for straight murder. We'll voluntarily plead guilty to a regular murder. And the idea is that maybe in some future, Kouri could have a realistic shot at maybe some probation in the future, And so, there are attorneys who get away with that, and they're able to present a defendant in a way where that's the goal, and they actually best represent their client's interests, and, they get the best outcome possible within reason. Okay. So there could have been, let's say, lots of attorneys who might have immediately driven in that direction. But the problem is that it does become difficult when you have a client who most likely would most likely fire an attorney who proposed that. So you have to be, let's say, I hate to say it, but sometimes, like, say with the worst defendants, you almost need to have like a horse whisperer attorney who is more than just an attorney, but is also like a witch doctor. It can actually do voodoo with the client, and actually, at that level, because some of these clients have real defenses, and they have real personality issues. So it would take a very, very special attorney to be able to pull that off. And frankly, in my opinion, I think when you have somebody who has a delusional personality, in my opinion, you can't really represent them if you don't have some kind of psychologist, or maybe even like a psychologist / attorney who can act like a mediator in between the attorneys and the client. I think you need somebody with psychological sophistication to work as a triangle between the actual attorneys and the client, to get them to work on maybe not accepting some very bad things about the case, to at least consider it, so that they can even approach, let's say, developing a realistic defense. But in this case, unfortunately, and in my opinion, okay, I think the fact that everybody on the defense team, all of them came from this federal public defender background, very ideological, very politically oriented. They feel on a mission, to defend the presumption of innocence. Like, it's this high, like philosophical ideal, this constitutional mission. Sometimes people like that, because of their, I don't know, maybe some of the political problems, and just the fact that they approach their job as a mission, there's that kind of that extra passion that in some ways will make them too sympathetic to their defendant, too sympathetic to their client. Okay, when you're too sympathetic to your client, you can't really help them. And on top of that, if you have a narcissistic defendant who just cannot process adverse information, and it's very, very clear, just like with Meghan Markle, that nothing adverse about me can be said. Everything has to be positive, right? That can unfortunately infect any attorney. But if you already have that sense of a mission as this, this kind of like almost like at a religious level, this religious ideological level, standing up, and it's my life mission to stand up for the, the presumption of innocence and the rights of accused defendants. And whatever. I think it's going to make you even more susceptible to a narcissistic defendant, at least under certain circumstances. Maybe combined with the fact that these are mostly women representing Kouri, and Kouri is also a woman, and maybe Kouri is very good at maybe getting sympathy out of people. All these things is bad enough, but to make it even worse, okay, to make it even worse, and this is my final criticism of the defense team, is that I didn't see any sign, any sign that these people have, let's say, have a good understanding. Let's say everybody who works in law. I mean, we all know on paper what is circumstantial evidence, right? But some people just don't have a good functional. How would you say? Some people just don't have a good functional understanding of circumstantial evidence, right? In the old days, I think circumstantial evidence was much more prominent in criminal law, right? I think over time, it's sort of, people are less comfortable with circumstantial evidence, right? And that's unfortunate, because you have to kind of know how to process circumstantial evidence, because unfortunately, juries are pretty good at processing circumstantial evidence, right? So as an attorney, you have to really, I don't know, kind of like you can't get deluded on your own case. Like the worst thing an attorney can do is overestimate their case or underestimate, let's say, the opponent's case, right? An attorney who is overconfident in their case and who is too comfortable with the evidence in a case, that's a weakness as an attorney. You have to know what's not good about your own case. So in a sense, it's almost like a narcissism. Let's say if narcissism is the inability to process unfavorable information, right? If that is the fundamental of narcissism, then I think attorneys can also be narcissistic about their case, where they have trouble processing the unfavorable aspects of their case, especially when it comes to circumstantial evidence, okay? And what do I mean by that? Okay, the most obvious symptom, okay, that an attorney does not know how to process circumstantial evidence, okay, and this is a telltale symptom, and you guys can see it anywhere. It's obvious when you see it, and it's very common nowadays, okay, is when attorneys fall into the trap where they like to take little items of evidence in isolation, okay? Circumstantial evidence is the environment that takes pieces of evidence out of isolation and puts them into context. Okay, so if you really want to be honest about what circumstantial evidence is the context that allows pieces of evidence to be seen in relation to other pieces of evidence, right? So, for example, a sign of an attorney who does not know how to, let's say functionally, does not know how to process circumstantial evidence, they're going to take each item of evidence in isolation, okay? So, for example, if I were to say, okay, but if we just isolate and we just focus on the night that Eric took the drink or whatever, that Eric died, okay, on that night, okay, the question is, well, geez, who put the drugs in his drink, or was it even a drink? Was it a pill? Did he maybe just take a pill? Maybe nobody put anything in his drink. Maybe he just committed suicide. Hey, we don't know. The problem is you're seeing that in isolation. Okay, if you see it in isolation, I agree. That is reasonable doubt in isolation. The problem is that occurred in the context of a lot of other facts, right? And so the circumstantial evidence is what holds all those facts together in a context. Okay, so it's not just in isolation. This question about, well, how can we prove that it came from an alcoholic drink? How do we know Eric didn't take a pill? How do we know Eric didn't commit suicide? Okay, because you're looking at that in isolation. You're not looking at that incident in context, okay? In the context of a whole bunch of other things, not just the fact that Kouri was specifically asking for opioids. Okay, she didn't specifically ask for fentanyl, but she asked for opioids, and then she asked for the Michael Jackson stuff. Okay, even though the attorneys, they want to isolate the Michael Jackson, like, hey, what do you mean? Was she asking for propofol? That's a stupid way to interpret, okay? Nobody's going to think that meant she wanted propofol. What it means is she wanted something that could really put someone to sleep, really, really do the job, like a stronger medication, So when you put all these things into, let's say, context, combined with how terrible the marriage was, okay, the fact that Kouri was having this totally, involved affair with some other man. She was being totally disloyal to Eric. They had a crappy marriage. She stole money from him. She was under a lot of pressure. She had expressed to other people that she was desperate to get out of the marriage. She felt trapped in the marriage. When you put all those things together, okay, when you put it together with the fact that Eric had a very unusual pseudo-allergic reaction and really, had like a medical event just 2 weeks before he was killed, okay, right at the same time that Kouri was asking for the stronger stuff. You know what I mean? The timing, the context. In my opinion, it's an overwhelming case because I'm not looking at things in isolation. I'm looking at everything in context, okay? Because I'm not afraid to, let's say, I'm not afraid to think in terms of circumstantial evidence, right? And I think a good attorney has to be able to think in terms of circumstantial evidence. It's one of the basic skills you need in order to evaluate a case, okay? And I think also a really, really good lawyer, if they know they're not like the best at evaluating cases, a really, really good attorney who may be very good in court, okay, but a really, really good attorney might occasionally hire somebody outside of their law firm to do a little evaluation for them, okay, just as a feedback. I think attorneys need to be more open sometimes to letting an outsider give them an evaluation, somebody who doesn't have bias, who doesn't have any skin in the game, just to give them just an evaluation. You can always reject it. But I think sometimes when everything's in-house, okay, and you have 3 attorneys that are all ex-federal public defenders, I wish that maybe one of the members of that team could have come from a different background, okay, just to get some diversity in there. And so in my opinion, I think Kouri's narcissism actually infected the legal team, okay, but I also think the legal team had their own narcissism, that they overestimated their case, okay? They didn't want to process unfavorable information about their case, right? And on top of that, I see evidence that the defense team doesn't really have a workable, let's say, a functional appreciation and understanding in real world terms, not just what the books say, but a real world sense of how to apply and how to use circumstantial evidence, okay? Because I think the circumstantial evidence in this case is what made it so overwhelming. So anyway, the purpose of this video is just to kind of fuse together kind of just some reflections on, who is this Kouri Richins as a personality, to start to really try to understand what kind of personality are we actually dealing with, and sort of dovetail that in with basically my feelings and my reaction to the overall performance of the defense team, with the understanding these are very intelligent, very kind of high level people in the world of criminal defense, but nevertheless, in my opinion, I don't think they really gave Kouri the best representation, not because they're not smart, not because they're not, like, say, on the high level of attorneys. It's just that, anybody can be susceptible to, like, say, not being honest with yourself about how strong your case is, right? And then possibly the complication of having a narcissistic defendant who actually maybe in some ways kind of infects the attorneys so that they aren't able to provide, the healthiest and most effective assistance to that defendant. So anyway, just some ideas. These are just ideas. At this channel, what I want above all is for people to think for themselves. Okay, I don't want people to think what I think. I want people to disagree. I want people to, above all, just think for yourself. Okay, what I say here is I'm just talking. I'm giving my perspective. Okay. I don't want people to think what I'm thinking. Okay, this channel is above all, hopefully, something that would encourage people just to think for themselves. Okay, so I just offered you my point of view from let's say my background, from my biases, whatever. But feel free, please, to think for yourselves. And if you see it a different way, that's what this is all about. We all see things in a different way. So this conversation is open, not closed. Open. It's like I did not finish the idea here. We're just opening the door so that people can explore this case hopefully with an open mind, and hopefully not influenced by what other people think. We have to think for ourselves. So anyway, I think this is a very interesting case. I think this is one of the most, one of the most interesting, how would you say? I think this case presents one of the most interesting angles, and kind of opens the door to really helping refresh, I think, a lot of our ideas about what is psychopathy, what is narcissism, because this case really shows these two disorders or these two conditions really in action, and even affecting the way that Kouri was represented by her attorneys. Okay, so this is very deep, It doesn't just go to the crime she committed. It actually goes to the way she was represented. So I think it's a very fascinating case, at least in my opinion. It's the way I see it. So, I hope this was helpful to sort of open the door, maybe start a conversation, maybe, get people thinking, or maybe, just to throw another point of view out there. But bottom line is, I really appreciate everybody's patience here. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you guys later. Thank you.